In this tutorial, we will cover chapter 4.1 of the book Spring Boot Quick Start. This chapter is a subchapter of chapter 4 that covers controllers and endpoints. So in chapter 4.1, we are discussing two annotations that can be given to a class, and this annotation tells Spring that a class is controller, in other words, that it contains endpoints. And endpoints are methods called for specific URLs. Spring needs to collect these methods to properly configure application server like Tomcat, which is included in our Spring Boot web application. Application server needs to know for which URLs which method needs to be called. So let's start with controller annotation. Controller annotation tells a Spring that the class is controller, and endpoints in controller class by default return a view. By view, we mean HTML or time-leaf pages. If you want endpoint to return actual data like a string, you should annotate endpoint with response body, as is done in this tutorial. So let's take a closer look at our controller. So this is our controller, and as you can see, my controller is a Java class, and by using this annotation, we are telling Spring that this Java class is a controller, or in other words, that it contains methods that can be used as endpoints. But not every method in my controller will automatically be used as an endpoint. For a method to be used as endpoint, it has to be annotated with annotation like request mapping or some other related annotation. Specifically, this annotation tells a Spring Framework that this method should be called when URL ends with hello. And this response body tells the Spring that it should return this string. Without response body, this value will not be returned as a string. Instead, Spring Framework would try to find HTML or time-leaf file with this name and to return that instead. We will be covering that in some later tutorials, but for now we will stick to endpoint returning a string, and if class is annotated with controller endpoint, then in order controller annotation, then in order for an endpoint to return string, it also needs to annotate it with this response body annotation. When we start the application and enter this URL, we will have following response. Because Spring Framework, we use the last part of the URL, and then it will find a method that should be called for this last part of URL, in which case, in our case, this is hello. And then it will execute this method and return back the string hello from controller. Another annotation that can be used to tell Spring Framework that a Java class is a controller is a REST controller annotation. REST controller annotation tells a Spring that class is controller, in other words, that it contains endpoints, and endpoints in REST controller class can only return data. They can't return view like HTML or time-leaf. Using REST controller is the same as using controller in combination with response body for the endpoint, which is exactly what we did use in our previous example. So in our previous example, our controller was using controller annotation in combination with response body annotation to specify that endpoint should return data and not HTML file or timeleaf file. So with REST controller annotation, all endpoints by default return data. In other words, this string will not be interpreted as a name of an HTML or timeleaf file, which is why in this case we didn't have to add this additional annotation, which we did have in a previous example where we didn't use REST controller, but instead where we used just controller. So REST controller is used, annotation is used when a Java class contains endpoints and all of the endpoints are supposed to return some kind of data directly instead of some HTML or timeleaf page. Throughout the tutorials, we will in most cases use a REST controller, and controller annotation will only be used in few examples where we are actually returning HTML file or timeleaf file or JSP. But in modern application, controllers usually return JSON or XML files, strings, and in that case, we are using a REST controller annotation.